"Out of my way, you old hag," the teenager sneered, deliberately shoving 89-year-old Maggie Sullivan's shopping cart, sending it crashing into a display of canned goods at the front of Walmart. The loud clatter echoed through the store as dozens of cans rolled across the polished floor. Maggie, a decorated Navy nurse who had served in 3 conflicts, stumbled but caught herself on a nearby shelf, her weathered hands trembling not from fear but from a slow-burning rage she hadn't felt since her days in Vietnam. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The group of teenagers howled with laughter, capturing the moment on their phones as the diminutive elderly woman in her neat cardigan and Naval Veterans Association cap tried to regain her composure. "World War II exhibit coming to life," one of them jeered, high-fiving his companions. They swaggered away toward the electronics section, leaving Maggie surrounded by scattered Campbell's soup cans and sympathetic but hesitant onlookers. What those boys didn't know was that Maggie Sullivan hadn't spent nearly 9 decades on this earth being pushed around. And they certainly couldn't have known about the gathering at the VFW hall just across the parking lot, where a dozen Navy SEALs were being honored in a private ceremony. SEALs who had a profound respect for those who had served before them, especially the pioneering women of the naval forces who had broken barriers when the world told them they couldn't. Maggie Sullivan had lived 89 remarkable years, and more than 6 decades of that life had been dedicated to service. She had enlisted in the Navy Nurse Corps at 19, desperate to follow in the footsteps of her father, a Navy man who had died at Pearl Harbor when she was just 5 years old. She served with distinction through the Korean War, where she'd earned her first commendation for bravery under fire when her field hospital was shelled. She continued through Vietnam, where she'd led a surgical unit that saved hundreds of lives during the Tet Offensive, earning the Navy Cross, an almost unheard-of decoration for a woman at that time. Her small apartment in the veterans' retirement community was a testament to her life of service, not ostentatious or showy, but carefully preserved. The walls held faded black and white photographs of young Maggie in her crisp white nurse's uniform, standing alongside battle-weary sailors and Marines whose lives her steady hands had helped save. A glass-fronted cabinet contained her medals, commendations, and service patches, treasures she never displayed on her person but kept as sacred reminders of the men and women she'd served alongside, many of whom never came home. Her body had grown frail with age, her steps slowed by arthritis that had settled into her joints from years of standing through marathon surgical sessions in damp field hospitals. She relied on a slender silver cane now, its handle worn smooth from years of use. But her eyes, sharp blue eyes that had once guided a steady needle through human flesh during artillery barrages, still held the unflinching direct gaze of someone who had stared death in the face countless times and never wavered. Maggie lived a quiet life now. Her days were punctuated by volunteer work at the local VA hospital, where younger veterans sometimes recognized the significance of the small Navy crosspin she wore only on special occasions. She tended a small garden of medicinal herbs, a skill she'd learned from a Vietnamese nurse during the war. She visited the library twice weekly, preferring history and medical journals to fiction. And every Sunday she attended church, then treated herself to a modest lunch at the Walmart cafe before doing her weekly shopping. She didn't ask for much from life anymore, just a modicum of peace, a bit of independence, and the basic respect she'd earned through decades of sacrifice. Today was Sunday, and she'd been following her usual routine. The church service had been particularly moving, a young pastor speaking eloquently about honoring those who came before us. She'd enjoyed her usual lunch of soup and half a turkey sandwich at the cafe, watching families shop together, taking simple pleasure in their ordinary happiness. She was just beginning her shopping, methodically working through her shortlist when she'd encountered the group of teenagers, 5 boys and 2 girls, probably 16 or 17 years old, loud and restless, taking up the entire width of the aisle with their performative swagger. Maggie had seen their type before. In her day, they might have been called greasers or hoods. Every generation had its disaffected youth, pushing boundaries, testing limits. Usually she gave such groups a wide berth, not out of fear but from a desire to avoid unnecessary confrontation. Today, however, they were blocking the entrance to the canned goods aisle she needed to access. Her arthritic hip was bothering her more than usual, and she didn't relish the idea of walking all the way around to the next aisle over. So she approached cautiously, keeping her expression neutral. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice carrying the slight rasp of age but still clear and confident. "I need to get through to the soup, if you wouldn't mind." The apparent leader of the group, a tall boy with artificially whitened hair and an expression of perpetual disdain, looked down at her with contempt. His eyes flicked to the Naval Veterans Association cap she wore, then back to her face. "Navy, huh?" he said, making no move to clear a path. "My grandfather was in the Navy, said it was full of losers too scared to fight on land." His friends snickered appreciatively. Maggie had heard worse, far worse, from injured Marines in her care who'd been delirious with pain and fever. She kept her voice level. "Everyone serves in their own way, young man. Now if you could just let me pass." "Everyone serves," the boy mimicked in a high, tremulous voice, drawing more laughter. "What did you do, Grandma? Fold towels on a boat?" Maggie felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not anger exactly, but the kind of focused intensity that had served her well in crisis situations. "I was a surgical nurse in 3 wars, son. Now there's no need for rudeness. I just need to get my groceries." Another teen, a girl with elaborately styled hair and makeup that seemed out of place in a Sunday afternoon Walmart, rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh my God, Travis, she's going to bore us with war stories now. Can we go? I want to check out the new phones." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Hold up, Brittany," Travis said, a malicious gleam in his eye. "I think we should help the old lady with her shopping, don't you guys?" Without warning, he reached out and gave Maggie's cart a hard shove, sending it careening into the display of Campbell's soup at the end of the aisle. "Out of my way, you old hag," he sneered as the cart collided with the carefully stacked cans, creating a cacophony of clattering metal as dozens of cans cascaded to the floor. The sudden violence of the action caught Maggie off guard. She stumbled, nearly losing her balance, and had to grab a nearby shelf to steady herself. The teenagers erupted in laughter. One of them had his phone out, recording the entire incident. "World War II exhibit coming to life," he crowed, as if this casual cruelty was the height of wit. They high-fived each other, celebrating their victory over an elderly woman who had saved more lives before breakfast on a typical day in Korea than they would likely impact in their entire existences. As they swaggered away toward the electronics section, still laughing and replaying the video, a Walmart employee hurried over to help Maggie and clean up the mess. "I am so sorry, Mom," the young man said, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Are you all right? I can call security if you want to report them." Maggie straightened her cardigan and adjusted her cap, her hands steady now as the initial shock wore off. "I'm fine, thank you. Don't trouble yourself about security." She looked down at the scattered cans, feeling a disproportionate sadness at the disorder. In her nursing days, disorder meant danger, meant lives at risk. She had always maintained immaculate supply cabinets and surgical trays. "Let me help you clean this up," she said, bending carefully to retrieve a can despite the young employee's protests. "Please, Ma'am, you don't have to do that. It's my job." "Nonsense," Maggie replied, placing the can on the shelf. "I've never..." Left a mess for someone else to clean up in my life, and I'm not about to start now." Together, they restored order to the display, Maggie working methodically despite her arthritis. The young employee, his name tag read Miguel, chatted respectfully as they worked. "My uncle was in the Navy," he offered, "served on the USS Ronald Reagan. He always talks about how strict everything was, how everything had to be perfect, all the time." Maggie smiled. "Naval discipline. It stays with you. Your uncle sounds like a good man." "He is," Miguel agreed, placing the last can on the shelf. "He wouldn't stand for what those jerks did to you. Neither would my manager. Actually, sure you don't want me to call someone." Maggie was about to decline again when something stopped her. Not the ache in her hip or the lingering indignity of the incident, but a deeper, older instinct. She was a Navy nurse. Navy personnel didn't just walk away from unprovoked disrespect, not even at 89. "Actually," she said slowly, "is there a phone I could use? My cell phone is at home. I rarely remember to bring the confounded thing." "Of course," Miguel said, leading her to the customer service desk, where a middle-aged woman with a kind face offered her the store phone. "Thank you," Maggie said, then hesitated. She wasn't planning to call store security or the local police. They'd likely do little more than issue a warning to the teenagers, if that. No, she had something else in mind. She remembered the flyer she'd seen posted at the VFW hall last week, a special ceremony honoring a SEAL team that had recently returned. From deployment, scheduled for today, right across the parking lot from Walmart. The ceremony would be finishing up about now, and the commander of that SEAL team, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, had visited her volunteer shift at the VA hospital last month. He'd been accompanying a teammate who'd lost a leg, showing extraordinary respect to the older veterans in the ward. She dialed the number for the VFW hall, her fingers moving with the precision that had once threaded sutures through torn flesh under battlefield conditions. "Veterans of foreign wars, post 1247. How can I help you?" came a gruff male voice. "This is Captain Margaret Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps, retired," Maggie said, her voice taking on the crisp authority she'd used when directing surgical teams. "I need to speak with Lieutenant Commander Jackson of SEAL Team 8, if he's available. It's regarding a situation at the Walmart across your parking lot involving disrespect to a veteran and potential public disturbance by minors." There was a brief pause, then, "Captain Sullivan." "Yes, ma'am. Hold one moment, please." The respect in the man's voice was immediate and unquestioning. Her rank and identification had triggered an automatic response, veteran to veteran, Navy to Navy. While she waited, Maggie noticed Miguel and his supervisor exchanging glances. She could read their expressions easily, surprise mixed with newfound respect. Most people looked at her and saw only an elderly woman, forgetting that before she was old, she had been young and strong and determined. They forgot that beneath her weathered exterior lived the same woman who had once held a dying sailor's heart in her hands, manually pumping it until a surgeon could take over. The line clicked, and a deep, authoritative voice came on. "Captain Sullivan, Lieutenant Commander. Ryan Jackson here. What can I do for you, ma'am?" Briefly and factually, Maggie recounted what had happened. The blocked aisle, the disrespectful comments, the deliberately shoved cart, the teenagers currently in the electronics section recording themselves mocking her. She didn't embellish or appeal for sympathy, simply stated the facts as she would have in a medical report. "They disrespected the uniform, Commander," she finished quietly, "and they took pleasure in causing distress to a senior citizen. I believe they could benefit from some guidance." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Then Lieutenant Commander Jackson spoke, his voice controlled, but with an unmistakable edge of cold anger. "Are you all right, Captain? Do you need medical assistance?" "Negative, Commander. I'm shaken but uninjured." "Understood, Captain. Electronics section, you said. How many individuals? 7. 5 male, 2 female, mid to late teens. Roger that. Please stay where you are, Captain. My team and I will be there in less than 5 minutes. Sullivan, did you say? You wouldn't happen to be Maggie Sullivan, who ran the surgical unit during Tet? Maggie was surprised. Yes, that's correct. A new note of reverence entered Jackson's voice. My father was a Marine at Khe-Sanh, Captain. He told me stories about the Angel of Saigon, who could operate for 48 hours straight and never lose her cool, even when the mortars were falling. It would be my honor to address this situation. The line went dead, and Maggie handed the phone back to the customer service representative, who was watching her with wide eyes. Was that? Did you just call the Navy SEALs about those kids? She asked in disbelief. Maggie allowed herself a small smile. They were available, she said simply, and they understand the concept of respect. Miguel looked toward the electronics section with something approaching pity. Those idiots have no idea what's coming, do they? No, Maggie agreed, settling herself on a bench near the customer service desk. They don't, but they will. She didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, the automatic doors at the front of the Walmart slid open, and Lieutenant Commander Jackson entered. He wasn't alone. Behind him came 11 other men in crisp civilian attire, polo shirts, khakis, and sport coats that couldn't quite disguise the disciplined physicality of their bearers. They didn't rush or make a scene. They moved with the controlled efficiency. That was the hallmark of Special Operations Forces. Not running, but covering ground with purpose, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. Jackson spotted Maggie immediately and led his men directly to her. In front of the wide-eyed Walmart staff and customers, he stopped and rendered a perfect salute. Captain Sullivan, ma'am, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Jackson and elements of SEAL. Teammate reporting as requested. Maggie rose to her feet with difficulty, but returned the salute with military precision. At ease, Commander. Thank you for your prompt response. Jackson nodded to his men, and 2 of them positioned themselves near Maggie in a respectful but protective stance. The other 9, led by Jackson himself, moved silently and purposefully toward the electronics section. They didn't speak, didn't posture, didn't need to. The authority they carried was innate, earned through years of the most grueling training and combat experience the military could provide. Customers instinctively moved out of their way, some pulling out phones to record what was happening, sensing something extraordinary was unfolding in the mundane setting of their local Walmart. Maggie couldn't see what was happening in the electronics section from her position, but she could imagine it. The teenagers, still laughing and replaying their video, suddenly aware of the presence of a dozen powerfully built men with the unmistakable bearing of elite warriors. The dawning realization that their actions had consequences they hadn't anticipated. The 2 SEALs who remained with Maggie maintained a respectful silence, standing at parade rest, their eyes constantly moving, monitoring the environment with professional detachment. One of them, a man with a faded scar running along his jawline, spoke quietly. It's an honor to meet you, Captain Sullivan. My name is Petty Officer First Class Rodriguez. My grandfather was a Khe-Sanh as well. He didn't make it home, but my grandmother told me a nurse named Sullivan wrote her the kindest letter about his final hours. Maggie's eyes softened. I wrote many such letters, son. Too many. What was your grandfather's name? Carlos Rodriguez, ma'am. He was with the 26th Marines. Maggie closed her eyes briefly, searching through memories from over 50 years ago. Dark hair, broken nose that hadn't healed quite right, had a picture of twin baby girls he carried everywhere. Rodriguez's eyes widened in astonishment. Yes, ma'am, those were my mother and aunt. He was very brave, Maggie said softly. He held on long enough to know his girls would be okay. Not all of them had that comfort. Rodriguez swallowed hard, his professional demeanor momentarily cracking. Thank you, ma'am. That That means more than I can say." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the return of Lieutenant Commander Jackson and his men. They moved with the same disciplined efficiency, but now they had company. The 7 teenagers walked among them, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They looked shell-shocked, their faces pale, some of them visibly trembling. They didn't look like they'd been physically harmed in any way, but whatever had been said to them had clearly had a profound impact. Jackson led the group to where Maggie sat. "Captain Sullivan," he said formally, "these young people have something they would like to say to you." One by one, the teenagers stepped forward and offered stammering, genuine apologies. Travis, the ringleader, couldn't meet Maggie's eyes as he mumbled his regrets. The girl, Brittany, had tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. After the last apology, Jackson spoke again, his voice level but with steel beneath the surface. "Captain Sullivan, these young people have agreed to perform community service at the VA hospital every weekend for the next 3 months. They'll be assisting veterans, learning about service and sacrifice, and hopefully gaining some perspective on what it means to respect those who have served this nation. Is this acceptable to you, Mom?" Maggie looked at the teenagers, seeing not just their current shame, but their potential. They were young, thoughtless, but not irredeemable. "That would be appropriate, Commander. I volunteer there on Saturdays. Perhaps I'll see some of you there." The teenagers nodded vigorously, clearly eager to be anywhere but under the stern gaze of a dozen Navy SEALs. "Additionally," Jackson continued, "they have volunteered to clean up the entire store before they leave today, starting with reorganizing any displays they may have disturbed. The store manager has approved this arrangement." Miguel, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with undisguised amazement, whispered to his supervisor, "Best Sunday shift ever." Jackson turned to his men. "Petty Officer Thompson, Petty Officer Ramirez, please escort these young people to the manager's office to get their assignments. The rest of you are dismissed. Thank you for your assistance." As the SEALs began to disperse and 2 of them led the subdued teenagers away, Jackson turned back to Maggie. "Captain Sullivan, may I escort you while you finish your shopping? It would be my honor." Maggie smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature in the store. "I would appreciate that, Commander. My list isn't long." As they walked slowly through the aisles, Jackson pushing her cart while she selected her items, he spoke with genuine respect. "My father told me once that the doctors got all the credit, but it was the nurses who won the war. He said Captain Sullivan ran her surgical unit like a ship, tight, efficient, and with no tolerance for nonsense. He said when the incoming wounded saw your face, they knew they had a fighting chance." Maggie felt a sudden tightness in her throat. "Your father was too kind. We all did what we had to do. He's still alive, ma'am. Lives in Arizona now. When I tell him I met you, he's going to want to call you." "I'd like that," Maggie said, surprised at how much she meant it. So many of her contemporaries were gone now, their voices silenced, their stories fading. To connect with someone who remembered those desperate days, who had been there in the mud and blood and fear, it was a gift she hadn't expected. As they reached the checkout, Maggie noticed that news of what had happened had spread throughout the store. Customers were watching her with new eyes, some nodding respectfully, others coming up to thank her for her service. The cashier refused to let her pay, saying the store would cover her groceries as an apology for her experience. "Lieutenant Commander," Jackson insisted on carrying her bags to her car, a modest sedan with a Navy veteran license plate and a carefully maintained exterior. As he placed the groceries in her trunk, he rendered one final salute. "Captain Sullivan, it has been a privilege. If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. My team and I are at your service." Maggie returned the salute, her back straight despite her years. Thank you, Commander. Please thank your men as well. You've restored an old woman's faith in the younger generation today. The honor was ours, ma'am, Jackson replied, his sincerity evident. And those kids may have learned the most important lesson of their lives. I have a feeling at least one or two of them might find their way to a recruiting office in a few years. As Maggie drove home to her small apartment, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. The incident had been unpleasant, yes, but the response, the immediate, unquestioning support from her fellow sailors, even those generations removed from her own service, had been a powerful reminder of what had always sustained her through the darkest times. The Navy wasn't just a branch of the military. It wasn't just ships and uniforms and regulations. It was a family, a continuum stretching back through centuries and forward into an unseen future. It was the understanding that no one who wore the uniform was ever truly alone, even decades after they'd put it aside. As she carefully unpacked her groceries, placing each item in its designated spot with typical naval precision, she noticed her hands weren't shaking anymore. The steady rhythm of purpose had returned, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. Perhaps she would call her niece tonight, she thought. Tell her about her unusual day, maybe even dig out some of her old photographs, the ones she usually kept tucked away because the memories were sometimes too intense, too raw. It might be time to share those stories again, to ensure they lived on after she was gone. Because today had shown her that while respect might sometimes seem in short supply in the modern world, there were still those who understood its importance, who would drop everything and cross a parking lot to defend it. And perhaps more importantly, there were young people like Travis and his friends who could learn, who could change, who could come to understand what it meant to be part of a society where sacrifice and service were honored. Maggie Sullivan had spent her life putting others back together, mending broken bodies with skilled hands and broken spirits with unyielding compassion. Today, something in her own spirit that had been quietly breaking under the weight of years and loss had been mended by the unexpected reminder that she was still part of the Navy family, still respected, still valued. She placed her Naval Veterans Association cap on its hook by the door, running a finger along the embroidered insignia. "Fair winds and following seas," she murmured, the traditional Navy blessing feeling particularly apt today. The story of what happened at Walmart spread rapidly through the community. By evening, local social media was filled with accounts from witnesses, most expressing admiration for the dignified elderly woman and the respectful but firm response of the Navy SEALs. Several videos had been posted showing snippets of the teenagers' subdued apologies and their subsequent cleaning efforts under the watchful eyes of their SEAL supervisors. The manager of Walmart, recognizing good publicity when he saw it, announced a new monthly discount day for veterans and active duty military personnel. The local newspaper sent a reporter to interview Maggie, who reluctantly agreed only when assured the focus would be on the importance of community service and respect for veterans, rather than on the specific incident with the teenagers. For the teenagers themselves, the impact was profound and immediate. Travis, the ringleader, deleted the video of Maggie from his phone that very afternoon, his hands still shaking slightly from his conversation with Lieutenant Commander Jackson. None of them spoke much about what exactly the SEALs had said to them in the electronics section, but whatever it was had clearly struck home. The following Saturday, all 7 teenagers arrived at the VA hospital, nervous but determined to fulfill their commitment. Maggie was there in her volunteer capacity, wearing her modest uniform with the small Navy crosspin that most people never noticed or understood. She assigned them simple but meaningful tasks, delivering mail to bedridden veterans, assisting with physical therapy sessions, simply sitting and listening to old war stories from men and women whose sacrifices had largely been forgotten by society at large. By the end of that first day, the teenagers were subdued, many of them visibly moved by what they had seen and heard. Brittany, who had been so dismissive in Walmart, found herself sitting beside the bed of a Vietnam veteran with advanced cancer, helping him write a letter to his granddaughter. When she emerged from his room, her eyes were red from crying, but there was a new determination in her face. "I had no idea," she told Maggie quietly. "No idea what they went through, what you went through. They never teach us this stuff in school." "That's why you're here now," Maggie replied simply, "to learn what can't be taught in classrooms." Over the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The teenagers not only completed their assigned hours, but began to volunteer for additional shifts. Travis, who had shown such contempt for Maggie's Navy service, discovered that his aptitude for video games translated surprisingly well to helping younger veterans learn to use prosthetic limbs controlled by electronic interfaces. He began spending extra time in the prosthetics lab, fascinated by the technology and moved by the determination of the amputees he worked with. Lieutenant Commander Jackson and his team deployed again 3 weeks after the Walmart incident, but before they left, they visited the VA hospital on a Saturday when all the teenagers were there. They spent time talking with them, not lecturing, but sharing stories, answering questions, treating them not as delinquents but as young people with potential who had made a mistake and were making amends. When Jackson found Maggie to say goodbye before his deployment, he handed her a small box. "From my father," he explained. "When I told him I'd met you, he insisted I give you this." Inside was a tarnished metal bracelet engraved with the name Captain Margaret Sullivan and the words "Angel of Saigon." A note explained that Jackson's father had made it while recovering at her surgical unit, intending to give it to her as a token of gratitude. But in the chaos of war, he never had the chance. "He's kept it all these years," Jackson said. "Said he owed you his life and never got to properly thank you." Maggie traced the crude lettering with a fingertip, memories flooding back. The endless surgeries, the constant fear, the small triumphs amid overwhelming tragedy. "Please, thank him for me," she said softly. "And come back safely, Commander. That's an order." Jackson grinned and saluted. "Aye, aye, Captain." 3 months later, when the teenagers' community service requirement was officially complete, they organized a surprise for Maggie. With the help of the VA hospital staff and several veterans, they arranged a small ceremony in the hospital garden where they presented her with a beautified shadow box for her medals and commendations, handcrafted by Travis's father, a carpenter. "We wanted you to know that we understand now," Travis said, the arrogant boy from Walmart, completely transformed. "What these mean, what you did. And we're sorry for how we treated you." Brittany stepped forward. "And we wanted to tell you that we've all signed up to continue volunteering here, not because we have to, but because it matters." Maggie, never one for public displays of emotion, found herself momentarily speechless. She looked at these young people, still teenagers with their whole lives ahead of them, but somehow fundamentally changed from the thoughtless group that had mocked her in Walmart. "In the Navy," she said finally, "we have a saying, ship, shipmate, self. It means the mission comes first, then your comrades, then yourself. I think you're beginning to understand that now, and that understanding will serve you well, whatever path you choose in life." As the small gathering broke up, Maggie found herself standing beside Miguel from Walmart, who had become a regular volunteer at the VA hospital as well, inspired by what he had witnessed that Sunday. "You know," he said, watching the teenagers, laughing with some of the veterans, "my uncle always told me that Navy people stick together no matter what. I guess he was right." Maggie smiled, fingering the tarnished bracelet she now wore alongside her watch. "Your uncle is a wise man, Miguel. The Navy isn't just a branch of service. It's a family, and family takes care of its own. She looked around at the garden full of people whose lives had unexpectedly intersected with hers. The teenagers who had found purpose through their mistake, the veterans who had found new listeners for their stories, the hospital staff who had witnessed the transformation, all because of a moment of disrespect in a Walmart aisle that had been answered not with more disrespect, but with firmness, dignity, and the unwavering support of the Navy family. Ship, shipmate, self, she murmured again, the old mantra as relevant now as it had been during her years of service. Some lessons, it seemed, truly were timeless. Maggie didn't have to wait long for her call to be answered. The phone at the VFW hall was picked up on the second ring, and a crisp professional voice responded, "Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 1247, Petty Officer Daniels speaking. This is Captain Margaret Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps, retired," Maggie said, her voice carrying the natural authority that had once commanded surgical teams under artillery fire. "I need to speak with Lieutenant Commander Jackson of SEAL Team 8 immediately if he's available." There was a brief pause. Then the petty officer's voice shifted, becoming even more respectful. "Yes, ma'am, Captain Sullivan. One moment, please." She could hear the rustle of movement, muted voices, then the sound of the phone changing hands. "Captain Sullivan?" The deep voice that came on the line held a mixture of respect and concern. "This is Lieutenant Commander Ryan Jackson. What can I do for you, ma'am?" Maggie kept her tone measured and factual, years of giving medical reports under extreme conditions, making her naturally concise. "Commander, I'm at the Woodland Hills Walmart across from your location. I've just been accosted by a group of teenagers who deliberately damaged store property and created a public disturbance while mocking my service. They're currently in the electronics section, recording and sharing videos of the incident. I believe they could benefit from some guidance regarding respect for veterans and appropriate public behavior." The line went silent for a beat. Then Jackson's voice returned with a controlled intensity that Maggie recognized immediately, the focused anger of a disciplined warrior. "Are you injured, Captain?" "Negative, Commander. Shaken but functional." "Understood. Can you provide a description of these individuals?" 7 teenagers, 5 male, 2 female, approximately 16 to 17 years old. The leader is a tall male with bleached hair wearing a red jacket. They're in the electronics section on the east side of the store. "Roger that, Captain. My team and I will be there in under 5 minutes. Please stay where you are." Jackson paused, then added with genuine concern, "And Captain Sullivan, are you certain you're all right?" The unexpected warmth in his voice touched Maggie. In her decades of service, she had grown accustomed to being the one who asked that question, rarely the recipient of such concern. "I'm fine, Commander. Just disappointed in their behavior." "Understood, ma'am. We'll address that disappointment directly." There was a new edge to Jackson's voice that suggested the teenagers were in for an educational experience they wouldn't soon forget. "Sullivan. Wait, are you Margaret Sullivan, the Angel of Saigon?" Maggie hadn't heard that nickname in decades. It transported her instantly back to the sweltering heat of Vietnam, the constant drone of helicopters, the smell of antiseptic barely masking the metallic tang of blood. "Yes, that's what some of the Marines called me during Tet. How did you know?" "My father was 2nd Lieutenant Daniel Jackson, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. He took shrapnel at Khe Sanh in '68. Said a Navy nurse named Sullivan saved his leg when the doctors wanted to amputate. He still walks with that leg because of you, ma'am." Memories flooded back. A young Marine, barely more than a boy. His leg shattered but salvageable. The exhausted surgeon ready to take the quicker, safer route of amputation after 36 hours on duty. Maggie insisting they try to save it, staying by the Marine's side for hours afterward, fighting infection with the limited antibiotics they had, refusing to give up. "I remember him," she said softly. "He had a photograph of a pregnant wife. He kept asking if he'd still be able to teach his child to play baseball." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Then Jackson's voice, noticeably thicker. "That child was me, Captain. And yes, he taught me to play. Coached Little League for 15 years. Maggie closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden connection across decades. This was why she had served, not for medals or recognition, but for moments like this, knowing that her stubborn refusal to give up had rippled forward through time in ways she could never have imagined. "It will be my honor to address this situation personally," Jackson continued, his voice regaining its professional edge, but now underlaid with a deeper resonance. "Please stay where you are, Captain. We're on our way." The line went dead, and Maggie handed the phone back to the customer service representative, who was watching her with wide eyes. "Ma'am, did you just call in the Navy SEALs on those kids?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and awe. Maggie straightened her cardigan with dignity. "I simply reported a situation to appropriate personnel who happened to be nearby. The Navy takes care of its own." Miguel, the young employee who had helped clean up the canned goods, was still standing nearby. He let out a low whistle. "Those kids have no idea what's coming, do they?" "No," Maggie replied with the faintest hint of satisfaction. "They don't." The next few minutes passed in a blur of curious customers and concerned staff. The store manager, a harried-looking man in his 40s, approached Maggie to apologize for the incident and assure her that the teenagers would be banned from the store. She listened politely, but knew that such a punishment would likely be worn as a badge of honor among their peers, doing nothing to address the fundamental lack of respect that had led to their behavior. True to his word, Lieutenant Commander Jackson and his team arrived in exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Not that Maggie was counting with the precision that had been drilled into her during her naval career. The automatic doors at the front entrance slid open, and the atmosphere in the store changed immediately. Jackson entered first, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes, a crisp navy blue polo shirt and khakis that couldn't disguise the disciplined physicality of his frame. Behind him came 11 other men of varying ages, all sharing that same unmistakable presence. They weren't in uniform, having just attended a private ceremony rather than an official function, but they might as well have been for the effect they had on the store's environment. They moved with coordinated efficiency, not rushing, but covering ground with purpose. Several customers stopped in their tracks, instinctively recognizing the quiet authority these men carried. A small child pointed and whispered to his mother, "Are they soldiers, Mommy?" Jackson spotted Maggie immediately by the customer service desk and led his men directly to her. As they approached, the SEALs fanned out slightly, their movements so synchronized they appeared choreographed. When Jackson stopped before Maggie, he rendered a perfect, crisp salute, a gesture of genuine respect, not perfunctory obligation. "Captain Sullivan, ma'am. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Jackson and elements of SEAL Team 8, reporting as requested." Maggie rose to her feet slowly, her arthritic hip protesting the movement, and returned the salute with military precision that belied her age. "At ease, Commander. Thank you for your prompt response." Jackson nodded to 2 of his men, who positioned themselves near Maggie, not hovering, but present, a protective detail that she recognized and appreciated even as the independent part of her nature wanted to protest that she didn't need looking after. The other SEALs, led by Jackson himself, moved with silent purpose toward the electronics section where the teenagers were still congregated. The 2 SEALs who remained with Maggie introduced themselves quietly. The younger one, a powerfully built man with a Polynesian heritage evident in his features, spoke first. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Maleko, ma'am. It's an honor to meet you. The older man, with silver threading his dark hair and a scar that ran along his jawline, followed suit. "Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, Captain. The honor is ours." Maggie nodded acknowledgement, then found herself asking, "Were either of you at the ceremony I interrupted?" Rodriguez smiled. "Yes, ma'am. Commander Jackson was receiving the Navy. Gross for actions during our last deployment. The presentation had just concluded when your call came in." Maggie felt a flash of dismay. "I pulled you away from his award ceremony? I wouldn't have called had I known—" Maleko interrupted gently. "Ma'am, with respect," the commander would say, "and has said, that responding to your call was more important than any ceremony. The Navy Cross recognizes past service. Your family, and family comes first." The simple declaration struck Maggie with unexpected force. Family. It had been years since she'd felt truly part of something larger than herself. Her blood relatives were scattered across the country, many too busy with their own lives to visit regularly. Her friends from her service years were mostly gone now, claimed by time and illness. She volunteered and stayed active. But there was a difference between being useful and being essential, between being respected and being cherished. Yet here stood these two warriors, men who had undoubtedly seen and done things she could scarcely imagine, treating her with the deference and care reserved for someone precious, not because of her age or her medals, but because of the uniform she had once worn, the oath she had taken alongside them across the decades. From the electronic section came no commotion, no raised voices, nothing to draw attention, just the sudden cessation of teenage laughter and conversation, a silence that spoke volumes. Curious, Maggie glanced in that direction, but the display, shelves blocked her view of whatever was transpiring. "What do you think Commander Jackson is saying to them?" she asked Rodriguez. The chief's expression remained professionally neutral, but a glint of something, satisfaction perhaps, flickered in his eyes. "Nothing they'll forget any time soon, ma'am. The commander has a way of making an impression, especially when it comes to matters of respect." Maleko nodded agreement. "He's not a shouter, doesn't need to be, but he can make you feel about 2 inches tall with just a look and a few choice words." Maggie understood. The best officers she had served under had possessed that same quality, the ability to correct and instruct without raising their voice, making their disappointment felt more keenly than any shouted reprimand could. It was a skill she had cultivated herself as a nursing supervisor, knowing that in the controlled chaos of a field hospital, steady authority saved more lives than emotional outbursts. After about 10 minutes, movement from the electronics section caught her eye. The teenagers were emerging, escorted by the SEALs, but they bore little resemblance to the swaggering, disrespectful group that had mocked her earlier. They walked with their eyes downcast, shoulders hunched, all previous bravado completely evaporated. Several looked like they were fighting back tears. The tall boy with the bleached hair, Travis, had a stunned expression, as if he'd just had his entire worldview dramatically rearranged. Lieutenant Commander Jackson led them directly to where Maggie sat. The transformation in his demeanor was subtle but significant. The focused intensity had been replaced by a calm authority, the kind that comes after a mission has been successfully completed. "Captain Sullivan," he said formally, "these young people have something they would like to say to you." One by one, the teenagers stepped forward to offer their apologies. There was nothing rote or mechanical about their words. Each apology was halting, genuine and deeply personal, in a way that suggested they had been encouraged to think very specifically about their actions and the impact of those actions. Travis went last, his face flushed with shame as he struggled to meet Maggie's eyes. "Ma'am, Captain Sullivan, I am so sorry for how I behaved. What I did was—" He faltered, glancing briefly at Jackson, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. "It was dishonorable. I disrespected you, your service, and everyone who wears or has worn the uniform. There's no excuse for that. I'm sorry." Maggie studied him thoughtfully. In her years of nursing, she had developed a finely tuned ability to distinguish genuine remorse from the performance of contrition. What she saw in Travis's face was real. The dawning realization of a young man who had, perhaps for the first time, been confronted with the consequences of his actions in a way that couldn't be dismissed or deflected. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "I hope you've learned something today." "Yes, ma'am," Travis replied fervently. "More than I can say." Jackson cleared his throat. "Captain Sullivan, with your permission, I've taken the liberty of arranging for these young people to begin a structured program of community service at the VA hospital, focusing specifically on assisting veterans. The program will run every weekend for the next 3 months under proper supervision. Would this meet with your approval?" Maggie felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with education. What these teenagers needed wasn't public humiliation or legal consequences, though they likely deserved both, but a fundamental shift in perspective, an opportunity to understand the world beyond their limited experience. "That would be entirely appropriate, Commander. I volunteer there on Saturdays myself. Perhaps our paths will cross." Jackson nodded, clearly pleased with her response. Additionally, before they leave today, they've agreed to help the store staff reorganize the displays. They disturb and perform other services as needed. The manager has approved this arrangement. Maggie nodded, noting the teenagers' expressions of relief. Likely they had feared far worse consequences and were grateful for the opportunity to make amends through service rather than face more severe punishments. As the 2 SEALs who had been designated to supervise the teenagers' clean-up efforts led them away, Jackson turned back to Maggie, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "Captain Sullivan, would you allow me to assist you with completing your shopping?" "It would be my privilege." The offer was made with such sincere respect that Maggie found herself accepting despite her fiercely independent nature. "Thank you, Commander. That would be most helpful." As they walked slowly through the aisles together, Jackson pushing her cart while she selected her items, he spoke of his father, how the elder Jackson had spoken of the Angel of Saigon. Throughout his childhood, how he had insisted that his son understand the debt he owed to the medical personnel who had served alongside the combat troops. "He wanted to find you after the war," Jackson explained as they examined the produce section. "But in those days, without the internet, it wasn't easy to locate people once they left the service. He wrote to the Navy Nurse Corps headquarters, but with personnel rotating home and records being what they were." "It was chaos," Maggie agreed, selecting a small bunch of bananas. "So many of us came home and just wanted to put it all behind us. The country wasn't exactly welcoming to Vietnam veterans, even those of us in medical roles." Jackson nodded understanding. "When I told him last month that I'd met a retired Navy nurse named Sullivan at the VA hospital, he immediately asked if it was Margaret Sullivan. When I confirmed it was, Jackson paused, emotion briefly shadowing his face. "He cried, Mum. First time I'd seen that since my mother passed." Maggie felt her own eyes growing moist. "The cases we remember most are the ones where we made a difference. Your father's determination to keep his leg, his focus on getting home to his family. That's what gave us the strength to keep trying when the easier path would have been amputation." They continued through the store, drawing curious glances from other shoppers who sensed the unusual nature of their pairing. The elderly woman in her neat cardigan and the powerfully built man in his prime, moving together with a synchronized respect that spoke of shared values and experiences, despite the decades that separated them. As they approached the checkout, the store manager intercepted them, insisting that Maggie's groceries would be provided at no cost as an apology for her experience. She attempted to decline the offer. Her generation didn't take handouts easily, but the manager was insistent. "Please, Captain Sullivan, it's the least we can do. And I want to assure you that we'll be implementing a new training program for our staff regarding assisting and respecting our veteran customers." Maggie relented gracefully, recognizing that allowing him to make this gesture was its own form of kindness. As they left the checkout, Jackson asked if he could carry her groceries to her car, another offer Maggie accepted with good grace, despite her instinct to manage on her own. In the parking lot, they passed the group of teenagers who were collecting shopping carts under the supervision of Petty Officer Rodriguez, their earlier swagger replaced by focused industry. Travis glanced up as Maggie and Jackson passed, offering a respectful nod that contained none of his previous insolence. At her car, a meticulously maintained older model sedan with a small navy sticker on the rear window, Jackson carefully placed her groceries in the trunk, then turned to face her, rendering another perfect salute. "Captain Sullivan, it has been an honor. My team is deploying again next week, but I'd like to give you my personal contact information, and my father's as well. He would very much like to speak with you if you're willing." Maggie returned the salute, touched by the gesture. "I would like that very much, Commander." Jackson produced a business card with both his and his father's information, then hesitated before adding, "Ma'am, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but my team and I would consider it a privilege if you would allow us to check in on you occasionally, especially while we're deployed, just to make sure you have everything you need." The offer struck Maggie in an unexpected place, a tender spot in her heart that had grown accustomed to self-reliance but still remembered the comfort of belonging. "That's very kind, Commander. I wouldn't want to be a burden on men with far more important concerns." Jackson's expression grew serious. "Captain Sullivan, with respect, there is nothing more important to us than making sure the people who paved our way are taken care of. You're part of our family, ma'am. Whether you've met us before today or not, the Navy takes care of its own." There it was again, that simple declaration of belonging that carried such weight. Maggie found herself nodding acceptance, recognizing the sincerity behind the offer. "Then I would be honored by your concern, Commander. And please, call me Maggie. I've been retired long enough to use my first name." Jackson smiled, a warm expression that transformed his professional demeanor into something more personal. "Only if you'll call me Ryan when we're not in formal settings." "Deal," Maggie agreed, extending her hand, which Jackson shook with gentle respect. As she drove home to her small apartment in the veterans' retirement community, Maggie found herself reflecting on the day's events with a sense of wonder. What had begun as a humiliating encounter had transformed into something unexpectedly affirming, a reminder that the bonds forged in service didn't end when the uniform was put away, that the family she had joined as a young woman still claimed her as one of their own. Her apartment felt different when she entered it that afternoon, not the quiet sanctuary of an elderly woman living alone, but a space filled with the echoes of connection, of belonging to something larger than herself. She put away her groceries with her usual methodical precision, then made herself a cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair by the window. On the small table beside her sat her phone, and next to it, Lieutenant Commander Jackson's card, with his father's number. Maggie picked it up, turning it over in her fingers, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. There was apprehension, certainly. Opening the door to the past wasn't always easy, especially when that past contained as much pain as joy. But there was also anticipation, a sense of completing a circle that had been left open for decades. With a decisive movement, she picked up the phone and dialed. "The connection was made," a voice answered, older, roughened by years, but with the unmistakable cadence of a Marine. And when she said, "Lieutenant Jackson, this is Captain Margaret Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps." The catch in his breath, the moment of stunned silence, followed by a warmth that reached across the miles and years, told her everything she needed to know. She had spent her life in service to others, healing bodies and comforting the wounded. Now, in her sunset years, she was discovering that the seeds of compassion and duty she had planted throughout her career were bearing unexpected fruit. Not just in the lives she had directly saved, like Daniel Jackson's, but in the values those people had passed on to their children and their children's children. The Navy SEALs, who had responded to her call at Walmart, were the inheritors of that legacy, carrying forward the principles of honor, courage, and commitment that had guided her own service. And in their respect for her, in their immediate and unhesitating response to her need, they had reminded her of a fundamental truth she had sometimes forgotten in the lonely years of her retirement. Once Navy, always Navy. The uniform might change, the body might age, but the bond remained unbroken by time or distance. As she spoke with Daniel Jackson, sharing memories and filling in the gaps of their shared history, Maggie felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made a difference, not just in the operating rooms of distant battlefields, but in the continuum of service that stretched from generation to generation, and that difference would continue to ripple outward, touching lives she would never know. In a world that often seemed to have forgotten the meaning of respect and the value of service, there were still those who remembered, who lived by the code she had embraced as a young woman. And perhaps, through their example and their dedication, they would teach others, even a group of thoughtless teenagers who had never before been confronted with the consequences of their actions or the true meaning of sacrifice. The Navy had taken care of its own today, and in doing so, they had reminded Maggie Sullivan that she was not just a retired veteran, not just an elderly woman navigating the challenges of aging alone, but a vital link in a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back through history and forward into a future she would help to shape even after she was gone. She was Navy, she was family, and she was home. The following Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made Maggie grateful to be alive despite the persistent ache in her joints. She dressed with particular care, a pressed blouse, her good slacks, sensible but polished shoes. She pinned the small Navy Cross emblem to her lapel, something she rarely did except on special occasions. Today felt like one, though she couldn't have explained exactly why. Her usual volunteer shift at the VA hospital began at 9 a.m. She arrived 30 minutes early, as was her habit, nodding to the security guard who greeted her by name and with genuine warmth. "Morning, Captain Sullivan. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Thomas. Any changes I should know about?" Thomas's face lit up with barely contained excitement. "Actually, yes, ma'am. There's some kind of special program starting today. Got a bunch of teenagers coming in to help out. Hospital director seemed pretty pumped about it." Maggie kept her expression neutral, though inwardly she felt a flutter of anticipation. "Is that so? Well, extra hands are always welcome." She made her way to the volunteer coordinator's office, where Diane Rogers, a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, who had been an Army logistics officer before taking this position, was arranging a stack of ID badges. "Maggie, perfect timing. I've got 7 new volunteers starting today, part of a special community service program. Lieutenant Commander Jackson from SEAL Team 8 set it up. Said you'd be aware of the circumstances?" Diane's raised eyebrows suggested both curiosity and a request for confirmation. "Yes," Maggie replied simply. "I'm familiar with the situation." Diane seemed to be waiting for elaboration, but when none was forthcoming, she continued professionally. "Well, they'll be here at 9. I thought since you know the background, you might help orient them to the floor. Maybe start them with some basic tasks. Mail delivery, water refills, that sort of thing. I'd be happy to, Maggie agreed, taking the stack of visitor badges Diane offered. At precisely 9 a.m., the elevator doors opened, and the 7 teenagers from Walmart emerged, accompanied by Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez. Their transformation was striking, gone were the provocative outfits and sullen expressions. Instead, they were dressed modestly and appropriately. Khakis or dark jeans, simple polo shirts or blouses. Their hair was neatly styled, faces scrubbed clean. They walked with nervous energy, but none of the aggressive swagger that had characterized their presence in the store. Rodriguez approached Maggie with a respectful nod. "Captain Sullivan, good morning. These young people are reporting for their first day of community service as arranged by Commander Jackson." "Thank you, Chief," Maggie replied, then turned her attention to the teenagers. "Good morning. I'm Captain Margaret Sullivan. I'll be supervising your orientation today." She studied their faces, noting the varying degrees of apprehension, shame, and uncertainty. Travis, the ringleader from the Walmart incident, stood slightly apart from the others, his posture rigid, his expression a complicated mixture of emotions. "First things first," Maggie said, handing out the ID badges. "These must be visible at all times while you're in the facility. You'll be dealing with men and women who have served this country, many of whom are recovering from physical and psychological trauma. They deserve your utmost respect and consideration." She led them through the necessary paperwork and a brief orientation on hospital protocols, patient privacy, and safety procedures. Throughout, she was crisp and professional, neither harsh nor especially warm. When the preliminary tasks were complete, she divided them into groups of 2, with Travis assigned to work with her directly. "Questions before we begin?" she asked. A girl with elaborately dyed hair, Brittany, if Maggie remembered correctly, raised her hand hesitantly. What exactly will we be doing?" "Whatever is needed," Maggie replied simply. "Today, you'll start with basic tasks, delivering mail and magazines to patients who can't leave their rooms, refreshing water pitchers, perhaps some light cleaning or organizing. As you demonstrate reliability, you may be assigned more complex duties." Another boy, slim with glasses, spoke up. Will we have to talk to the patients?" Maggie caught the anxiety in his voice, the fear of facing those they had so casually disrespected. "Yes, Jason. You'll interact with veterans of various ages and from different conflicts. Some will be friendly, others less so. Your job is to be unfailingly courteous and helpful, regardless of how they respond to you." She distributed their assignments and sent them off with their partners, keeping Travis with her. As they walked down the corridor toward the long-term care wing, she could feel the tension radiating from him. "You seem uncomfortable, Travis," she observed neutrally. He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am, I've never been in a place like this before." "A hospital?" "No, ma'am. A military hospital, with veterans and everything." Maggie considered this. "Your family doesn't have a military background?" "No, ma'am. My dad's an accountant, Mom's a teacher." They reached the nurses' station where Maggie collected a cart of mail and personal items for delivery. As they began moving from room to room, she watched Travis carefully. His initial awkwardness was painful to observe. He was too loud, then too quiet, stumbling over simple greetings, clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing. In the third room, they encountered Walter Perkins, a Vietnam veteran in his 70s who had lost both legs to diabetes, a common complication among those who had been exposed to Agent Orange. Walter was notoriously gruff, challenging even, for experienced volunteers. "Mail for you, Walter," Maggie announced as they entered. Walter glanced up from his television, his expression souring when he spotted Travis. "Who's the kid? Another one of those school volunteers who wants to gawk at the cripples for extra credit?" Travis froze, his face flushing. Maggie stepped in smoothly. "This is Travis. He's starting a community service program with us. Travis, this is Sergeant Walter Perkins, 173rd Airborne Brigade, who distinguished himself at the Battle of Dak To. Walter's eyebrows rose slightly at the specific reference to his service. You've been reading my file, Sullivan. I don't need to read your file, Walter. I remember you telling me about Dak To last month when I brought you those history books. You requested. Something in Walter's expression shifted, a grudging acknowledgement that he had been seen and remembered as an individual, not just another patient. He turned his attention to Travis. So what are you in for, kid? What kind of community service brings you here? Travis shot a panicked glance at Maggie, who kept her expression neutral, leaving the response up to him. After a moment's hesitation, he straightened his shoulders. I disrespected a veteran, sir, in public. It was wrong. Walter studied him intently. How'd you disrespect them? Travis swallowed hard. I pushed her shopping cart into a display, called her names, recorded it on my phone to show my friends. His voice grew smaller with each admission. Her? Walter's gaze shifted to Maggie, his eyes narrowing with sudden understanding. You talking about Sullivan here? Travis nodded miserably. Walter stared at him for a long moment, then burst into a raspy laugh. Kid, you have no idea how badly you messed up. Sullivan here isn't just any veteran. She's a goddamn legend. Walter, Maggie interjected, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But Walter was not to be deterred. No, this boy needs to hear this. Sullivan was what we called an angel of mercy in Nam, surgical nurse who could work 48 hours straight during mass casualties. Saved more lives than most of us took, and that's saying something. He fixed Travis with a hard stare. So when you pushed her cart and called her names, you weren't just disrespecting some old lady. You were disrespecting someone who held men's lives in her hands while artillery was falling all around her. Someone who wrote letters home to mothers whose sons died on her table, telling them their boys didn't die alone. Travis looked stricken, his eyes darting between Walter and Maggie with growing horror at the fuller picture of who he had so casually disrespected. Walter wasn't finished. And let me guess, when word got out about what you did, you had some visitors, military types who didn't raise their voices but somehow scared the living daylights out of you anyway? Travis nodded weakly. Good, Walter said with satisfaction. That's how it should be. We take care of our own. He turned his attention back to Maggie. What's in the mail today, Sullivan? Anything good? With the conversation redirected, Maggie handed him his letters and a package from his daughter. As they left the room, she could feel Travis's stunned silence like a physical presence. I didn't know, he finally whispered as they moved down the hall. About you, about what you did. Why would you? Maggie replied simply. I don't wear my history on my sleeve, Travis. Neither do most veterans. That's something to remember as you work here. Every person you encounter has a story, often one of extraordinary courage and sacrifice that isn't immediately visible. Throughout the morning, they continued their rounds. In each room, Travis encountered a different facet of military service and sacrifice. A young female veteran recovering from injuries sustained in Afghanistan. An elderly World War II survivor who shared stories of the Pacific Theater with surprising humor. A middle-aged former medic who now suffered from PTSD that made loud noises unbearable. By lunchtime, Travis was subdued but more engaged, asking thoughtful questions and listening intently to the answers. When they gathered in the hospital cafeteria to meet up with the other teenagers, Maggie observed a similar transformation in most of them. Their initial nervousness had given way to a more complex set of emotions: humility, curiosity, and in some cases, genuine connection with the veterans they'd been assisting. Brittany approached their table, her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. Captain Sullivan, could I ask you something? Of course. The man I was helping, Mr. Ramirez. He showed me pictures of his grandchildren and told me all about them. But then when I asked if he sees them often, he got really quiet and said they live across the country, and their parents don't bring them to visit because they're uncomfortable with his appearance. She swallowed hard. He has burns all over his face from an IED, and I didn't know what to say. Maggie considered the girl thoughtfully. The Brittany who had laughed at her in Walmart seemed very far away from this distressed young woman seeking guidance on how to navigate a painful human connection. "Sometimes there's nothing to say," Maggie replied gently. "Just listening is a form of respect, Brittany. Mr. Ramirez shared something personal with you because you showed him genuine interest. That's a gift in itself." After lunch, Maggie rotated the assignments, placing Travis with Jason to assist in the physical therapy department while she took Brittany to visit more patients. Throughout the afternoon, she watched the teenagers gradually finding their footing, their initial self-consciousness giving way to focused attention on the tasks and people before them. By the end of the day, when Chief Rodriguez returned to collect them, the transformation was remarkable. They gathered in the lobby, exhausted but with a different energy than they had arrived with, more centered, more thoughtful. Rodriguez approached Maggie while the teenagers gathered their belongings. "How did they do, Captain?" "Better than expected," she admitted. "They're quick learners when properly motivated." He nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Commander Jackson will be pleased to hear it. He's very invested in this program." "Speaking of the commander," Maggie said, "please convey my regards and my thanks." "I will, Mum, though he'd probably say he's the one who owes you thanks." And Rodriguez hesitated, then added, "He's shipping out on Monday, 6-month deployment. But he asked me to tell you that his father is still hoping to speak with you. Apparently, he's planning to visit the area next month specifically for that purpose." The mention of Lieutenant Commander Jackson's father, the young Marine whose leg she had saved all those decades ago, brought a warm feeling to Maggie's chest. "I look forward to meeting him." As Rodriguez gathered the teenagers to leave, Travis approached Maggie one last time. His demeanor had changed dramatically from the swaggering bully of their first encounter. He stood straight, made eye contact, and spoke with clear intention. "Captain Sullivan, I wanted to thank you for today. I learned a lot, more than I expected. I'll be better prepared next week." Maggie studied him, seeing past the practiced politeness to the genuine shift beginning to take place. "I believe you will, Travis. See you next Saturday." After they departed, Maggie completed her paperwork and prepared to leave. As she gathered her belongings from the volunteer locker room, Diane Rogers appeared in the doorway. "So, Diane," said with barely contained curiosity, "are you going to tell me the story behind those kids? Thomas at security said something about Navy SEALs escorting teenagers to apologize to you at Walmart?" Maggie smiled slightly. "It was a misunderstanding that's being rectified through appropriate channels." "Appropriate channels meaning Navy SEALs?" Diane's eyebrows rose. "Maggie Sullivan, in the 15 years I've known you, I don't think I've ever seen you call in the cavalry. These kids must have really crossed a line." "They did," Maggie acknowledged, "but more importantly, they're being given the opportunity to make amends in a meaningful way. That's what matters." Diane's expression softened. "You know, most people would have just reported them to store security or called their parents. Few would have seen this as a teaching opportunity." "I've spent my life in service to others," Maggie replied simply. "Old habits die hard." And the drive home was peaceful, the autumn colors painting the landscape in rich hues that reminded Maggie of her childhood in New England before the war, before the Navy, before her life had taken the turns that defined her. As she prepared a simple dinner in her tidy kitchen, her phone rang, an unusual occurrence in the evening. The number was unfamiliar. "Hello? Captain Sullivan?" A deep voice with the unmistakable cadence of military precision came through. The line, "Lieutenant Commander Jackson here. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Commander. I was just thinking about you, actually. Chief Rodriguez mentioned you're shipping out on Monday." "Yes, ma'am." 6-month deployment to the Indian Ocean. But I wanted to check in personally about the community service program. Rodriguez says the first day went well." "It did," Maggie confirmed. "Better than I anticipated. They're young and still learning. But I saw genuine effort today, especially from Travis." There was a note of satisfaction in Jackson's voice when he responded. "That's good to hear. Travis in particular needed this wake-up call. Smart kid with potential, but heading down a dangerous path." "I got that impression," Maggie agreed. "May I ask what you said to them that day at Walmart? They seemed profoundly affected." A brief chuckle came through the line. "Nothing they couldn't have heard from any responsible adult, Captain. I just made sure they were listening." "Well, whatever you said worked. They were model volunteers today." "That's good to hear." Jackson paused. "Captain, there's another reason for my call. My father is flying in next month specifically to meet you. November 15th to the 20th. I've arranged for him to volunteer at the VA hospital while he's here, so you two can have some time together." "I hope that's acceptable." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Maggie deeply. "More than acceptable, Commander. I look forward to meeting him." "He's been talking about nothing else since I told him I'd found you," Jackson said, warmth evident in his voice. "There's something else, Captain. I've taken the liberty of arranging for some of my team members who aren't deploying to check in on you periodically while I'm gone, just to make sure you have everything you need." Under normal circumstances, Maggie might have bristled at the implication that she needed looking after. But there was something about the way Jackson framed it, not as charity for an elderly woman, but as respect for a fellow service member, that made it easier to accept. "That's very thoughtful, Commander." "The Navy takes care of its own, Captain. Always has, always will." He paused. "I should let you go, but before I do, thank you." "For what?" "For saving my father's leg. For giving me the chance to play catch with him in the backyard. For being the kind of officer who showed me what service really means." His voice had taken on a deeper resonance. "And for giving those kids a chance to learn the same lesson." After they said their goodbyes, Maggie sat in her quiet apartment, the phone still warm in her hand, feeling a connection to the wider world that had sometimes eluded her in recent years. The day had been exhausting, but fulfilling in a way that reached beyond her usual volunteer work. Those teenagers, rude, thoughtless, and cruel as they had been that day at Walmart, were being given a chance to see beyond their limited perspective, to understand the cost and meaning of service in a way that might shape their future choices. The following week established a pattern. Every Saturday, the teenagers arrived at the VA hospital, each week a little less nervous, a little more engaged, a little more invested in the work. Maggie rotated them through different departments and patient interactions, deliberately exposing them to diverse experiences of military service and sacrifice. Travis, in particular, underwent a remarkable transformation. By the third week, he was arriving early, staying late, asking insightful questions about the patients and their needs. He developed a particular rapport with the younger veterans in the rehabilitation unit, his natural energy and enthusiasm providing a welcome distraction during grueling physical therapy sessions. On the fourth Saturday, Maggie arrived to find Travis already there, deep in conversation with Walter Perkins in the recreation room. She paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt what appeared to be an intense discussion. "So that's why you enlisted?" Walter was asking. "Because your grandfather was at Pearl Harbor?" Travis nodded. "Yeah, he never really talked about it much, but my mom said it changed him forever. I guess I just want to understand, to know what that was like." Walter's weathered face creased in a thoughtful frown. "Not something you can understand from the outside, son. But the fact that you're asking, that's a start." Maggie cleared her throat gently to announce her presence. Both men looked up, Travis jumping to his feet with newfound military crispness. "Captain Sullivan, good morning, ma'am." "Good morning, Travis." "Walter." She nodded to them both. "I didn't expect to find you here so early, Travis." A flush crept up his neck. I came in a bit early to talk to Sergeant Perkins. Hope that's okay." "More than okay," Maggie assured him. "Initiative is always welcome." Walter snorted. "Kid's been picking my brain about Marine boot camp. Seems he's considering enlisting after graduation." Maggie's eyebrows rose in surprise. This was an unexpected development. "Is that so?" Travis shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Just exploring options, ma'am. Nothing decided yet." "A worthy consideration," Maggie said neutrally. "The military can provide structure, purpose, and valuable skills. It can also be incredibly challenging." "That's what Sergeant Perkins was telling me," Travis agreed. "Said I've got some growing up to do first." Walter barked a laugh. "What I said, Sullivan, was that his attitude needed a major overhaul before any drill instructor would waste time on him. But he's making progress." As the day progressed, Maggie kept a closer eye on Travis, noting the way he interacted with the veterans with growing confidence and genuine respect. During their lunch break, she found him sitting alone, making notes in a small notebook. "May I join you?" she asked. He looked up, startled. "Of course, ma'am." He hastily closed the notebook, but not before Maggie glimpsed what appeared to be a list of military branches and their requirements. "Sergeant Perkins wasn't exaggerating then. You're seriously considering military service?" Travis hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I've been thinking about it a lot these past few weeks. Seeing all these veterans, hearing their stories. It's made me realize I want to do something that matters." "The military isn't the only path to a meaningful life, Travis," Maggie pointed out gently. "I know that," he agreed. "But there's something about it that feels right for me. The discipline, the purpose, the sense of being part of something bigger than myself." He met her eyes directly. "And honestly, after what happened, after how I treated you, and then learning about who you are, what you did, I want to prove that I can be better than that I can be someone who protects people instead of hurting them." Maggie was struck by the sincerity in his voice, the genuine transformation taking place in this young man who had so callously disrespected her just weeks ago. It was a reminder of why she had chosen the path of service rather than retribution, because sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect was not punishment but education, not rejection but inclusion. "That's a worthy aspiration," she said finally, "whatever path you choose." As the weeks passed, similar changes manifested in the other teenagers, though in less dramatic ways. Brittany developed a gift for reading to the visually impaired. Veterans, her expressive voice bringing books and letters to life. Jason, the quiet boy with glasses, discovered an aptitude for the administrative side of hospital work, helping to organize patient records with meticulous attention to detail. Each of them, in their own way, was finding value in service to others. True to his word, Lieutenant Commander Jackson's team members checked in on Maggie regularly during his deployment. They were unfailingly respectful, never intrusive, simply appearing at appropriate intervals to ensure she had everything she needed. Sometimes it was a phone call, other times a visit to help with household tasks that had become challenging as her arthritis worsened. One Seal, a skilled carpenter, repaired her porch steps without being asked, simply noticing they were becoming dangerous. Another, discovering her car needed maintenance, arranged for it to be serviced and returned, refusing any payment. Through These interactions, Maggie found herself gradually integrated into a support network she hadn't realized existed, the invisible web of connection that linked service members across generations and branches, ensuring that no one who had worn the uniform was ever truly alone or forgotten. November arrived with a crisp chill in the air, and the anticipation of meeting Daniel Jackson, the Marine whose leg she had saved in Vietnam and who was now flying across the country specifically to thank her. The day before his scheduled arrival, Maggie received an unexpected call from Travis. "Captain Sullivan, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Travis. What can I do for you?" There was a nervous energy in his voice. I wanted to tell you something. I enlisted in the Navy yesterday, delayed entry program. I'll finish high school first, then ship out to boot camp next June. Maggie took a moment to absorb this news. That's a significant decision, Travis. Are your parents supportive? They were surprised, he admitted. But yes, they're behind me. My dad actually said he's proud of how much I've changed these past few weeks. Said the community service program was the best thing that ever happened to me. And how do you feel about it? Nervous, he said honestly, but good nervous, like I'm finally doing something that matters. After they hung up, Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink. She thought about the ripple effects of that day at Walmart, how a moment of disrespect had set in motion a chain of events that led to transformation not just for Travis, but for all the teenagers involved. She thought about the Navy SEALs who had responded to her call with immediate and unquestioning support, demonstrating through their actions the enduring power of the bonds forged in service. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Jackson, the living legacy of a life she had saved decades ago, now extending that same lifeline to others. And she thought about her own journey, from a young nurse determined to make a difference in the chaos of war to an elderly woman still finding ways to serve, to teach, to connect. The uniform might change, the body might age, but the commitment to something larger than oneself remained constant. Tomorrow, she would meet Daniel Jackson, closing a circle that had been open for over 50 years. And somehow, it felt like both an ending and a beginning, a reminder that no act of service, no moment of courage or compassion was ever truly lost. They lived on in ways we might never see, rippling outward through lives touched and changed, through lessons learned and passed forward, through the unbreakable bonds of those who understand what it means to put others before themselves. The Navy takes care of its own. Always has, always will. The morning Daniel Jackson was scheduled to arrive dawned with a brilliant autumn sky, the kind of crystalline blue that seemed to hold infinite depth. Maggie woke earlier than usual, a flutter of anticipation in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. She chose her outfit with particular care, a tailored navy blue dress she usually reserved for special occasions, her sensible but polished shoes, and for the first time in decades, she pinned her full set of service medals to her chest. The weight of them felt both strange and familiar, a tangible reminder of the life she had lived and the woman she had been. As she carefully applied a touch of lipstick, another rarity in her daily routine, she studied her reflection in the mirror. Time had etched its passage in the lines of her face, the silver of her hair. But the eyes that looked back at her were unchanged, clear, direct, and unflinching. The eyes of a woman who had witnessed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage, and had somehow maintained her faith in the latter. The doorbell rang precisely at 9 a.m., as scheduled. Maggie smoothed her dress, took a steadying breath, and opened the door to find a man in his late 70s standing on her porch. Though his hair was silver and his face weathered by time, there was no mistaking the military bearing in his posture, the direct gaze that assessed and catalogued everything in his environment with trained precision. He wore a crisp button-down, shirt and pressed slacks, and at his throat was a Marine Corps tie pin that caught the morning light. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, these two strangers whose lives had intersected so profoundly in the chaos of war half a century ago. Then Daniel Jackson snapped to attention and rendered a perfect regulation salute. "Captain Margaret Sullivan," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "First Lieutenant Daniel Jackson, United States Marine Corps, retired reporting as ordered. 56 years late, ma'am, but present nonetheless." Maggie returned the salute with equal precision, then extended her hand. "At ease, Lieutenant. It's good to finally meet you properly." His hand engulfed hers, warm and callous despite his age. "The honor is entirely mine, Captain, more than you can possibly know." As they settled in her living room with coffee, the initial formality between them gradually eased into the comfortable camaraderie of shared experience. Danny, please, everyone calls me Danny," spoke of his life after Vietnam, his return home, his marriage to his high school sweetheart, the birth of his son Ryan, his career as a high school history teacher and baseball coach. "And all of it," he said, gesturing to his leg, which moved stiffly but functioned well enough to have allowed him an active life. "Because you refused to give up on a scared kid from Ohio who just wanted to walk his girl down the aisle and teach his children to play ball." Maggie shook her head modestly. "I was just doing my job, Danny. There were hundreds of patients, but I wasn't just any patient to you," he interrupted gently. "I know that now. Ryan told me what you said on the phone that day at Walmart, that you remembered me. Remembered the photo of my pregnant wife, remembered my worries about teaching my child to play baseball." His voice thickened with emotion. "Do you have any idea what that means? That after all these years, all the patients you must have treated, you still remembered me specifically?" Maggie considered this, then replied with simple honesty. "There are patients you never forget, Danny. The ones who fight the hardest, who have the most to live for. You were one of those. Your determination gave the medical team something to work with, a reason to try everything, not just the expedient solution." They spent the morning exchanging stories, filling in the gaps of 5 decades lived separately but connected by that one pivotal moment in a field hospital in Vietnam. Danny showed her photos of his family, his wife of 50 years, his son Ryan, who had followed him into military service but chosen the Navy's elite SEAL program instead of the Marines, his daughter who was a pediatric surgeon, his 5 grandchildren, who were his pride and joy. "All of them," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "All of these lives exist because you saved my leg, saved my future, when it would have been easier to amputate." Around noon, they drove together to the VA hospital, where Danny had arranged to volunteer alongside Maggie for the next 3 days. As they walked through the entrance, several staff members did double takes at the sight of Maggie in her full medals, a rare display that transformed her from the familiar, modest volunteer they knew into a visible representation of her distinguished service. Diane Rogers, the volunteer coordinator, greeted them with undisguised curiosity. "Maggie, you're early today, and oh my, the medals! I've never seen you wear them before." "Special occasion, Diane," Maggie replied with uncharacteristic warmth. "I'd like you to meet First Lieutenant Daniel Jackson, USMC, retired. He'll be volunteering with me for the next few days. Lieutenant Jackson, this is Diane Rogers, our volunteer coordinator and a former Army logistics officer." They exchanged pleasantries, and Diane provided Danny with the necessary paperwork and visitor badge. As they were preparing to begin their rounds, the elevator doors opened and Travis emerged. He was alone today, rather than with the usual, a group of teenagers, and he carried a small wrapped package. "Captain Sullivan!" he called, then stopped short when he noticed Danny and the unusual formality of Maggie's appearance. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company." "Not at all, Travis. This is Lieutenant Daniel Jackson. Commander Jackson's father. He's visiting from Arizona and volunteering with us today. Lieutenant, this is Travis Mitchell, one of our community service volunteers." Danny's eyes lit with recognition. "Ah, you're one of the Walmart kids." Travis flushed deeply. "Yes, sir, I am." "Ryan told me about that situation," Danny said, studying the teenager with interest. "Said you've been making good progress here." "Trying to, sir," Travis replied, then turned to Maggie. "Captain Sullivan, I know today isn't a regular volunteer day for us, but I wanted to drop this off for you." He handed her the small package. "It's just a thank you for everything." Touched by the unexpected gesture, Maggie unwrapped the package to find a beautifully framed photograph. It showed Travis in his newly issued Navy dress uniform from his delayed entry program, standing at attention with a serious expression, a striking contrast to the sneering teenager who had mocked her in Walmart just weeks ago. Tucked into the corner of the frame was his first military ID card. "I had the recruiting office take it," Travis explained. "I wanted you to have a copy because this wouldn't have happened without you, without what I learned here." Maggie studied the photograph, noting the transformation not just in Travis's appearance, but in his entire demeanor, the newfound discipline and purpose evident in his posture, the clarity in his eyes. "This is a meaningful gift, Travis. Thank you." Danny cleared his throat. "So Navy, huh? Not Marines." Travis smiled shyly. "No disrespect, sir, but I've gotten to know some of Commander Jackson's SEAL team these past few weeks. They've been checking in on Captain Sullivan while the commander is deployed. They're incredible, sir." "Can't argue with that," Danny conceded good-naturedly. "My son chose the same path, much to my initial dismay, but it suited him." As they continued their rounds of the hospital, Maggie observed the easy rapport that developed between Danny and Travis, two generations of military men, one at the beginning of his journey, one near its end, but connected by their shared respect for service and sacrifice. Danny shared stories of his time as a Marine, offering insights and advice about military life that Travis absorbed with eager attention. In the afternoon, they encountered Brittany and Jason, who had also come in on their day off to help with a special art therapy program for PTSD patients. Both teenagers were noticeably changed from their first day, more confident in their interactions with the veterans, more thoughtful in their approach to service. "Captain Sullivan!" Brittany exclaimed when she saw Maggie and her medals. "You look amazing. Are those all from your service?" "They are," Maggie confirmed, a hint of pride creeping into her voice despite her usual modesty. "The Navy Cross," Danny interjected, pointing to the most prominent medal on Maggie's chest, "second only to the Medal of Honor. Do you kids understand how rare that is? How exceptional the service must be to earn it, especially for a woman in that era?" The teenagers shook their heads, wide-eyed. Even Travis, who had spent the most time with Maggie, seemed startled by this new information. "Captain Sullivan ran a surgical unit during the Tet Offensive," Danny explained, his voice taking on the cadence of the history teacher he had been for decades. "When the hospital came under attack, she evacuated critical patients, established a new triage area in a more secure location, and continued performing emergency surgeries for 48 hours straight, while periodically having to take cover from incoming fire." He looked at Maggie with undisguised admiration. The citation mentions that she physically shielded wounded men with her own body during the most intense periods of the attack, sustaining shrapnel wounds herself, but refusing evacuation or treatment until all her patients were stable. Maggie felt a flush rising in her cheeks. "That's quite enough, Lieutenant. Ancient history now." But Danny wasn't finished. "The point is, kids, when you pushed her cart and mocked her at Walmart, you weren't just disrespecting an elderly veteran. You were disrespecting one of the most decorated Navy nurses in American history. Someone who saved countless lives, including mine, at great personal risk. The teenagers looked stricken, a new level of understanding dawning in their expressions. Travis, who had already begun to grasp the magnitude of who Maggie was through his time with Walter Perkins and other veterans, nonetheless seemed humbled by this additional information. "We didn't know," Brittany whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "We never thought about who she might be, what she might have done." "That's the point," Danny said, his voice gentler now. "You never know what battles someone has fought, what service they've rendered, what sacrifices they've made. That's why respect should be the default, not something earned through displays of medals or tales of heroism." It was a powerful teaching moment, one that Maggie might have shied away from if left to her own devices. Her natural inclination had always been to downplay her accomplishments, to focus on the job at hand rather than past glories. But watching the impact of Danny's words on these young people, she recognized the value in allowing her story to be told, not for her own psyche, but for theirs. As the day drew to a close, they gathered in the hospital cafeteria for coffee. The teenagers had been subdued since learning more about Maggie's service, processing this new information in light of their own actions and growth. "Captain Sullivan," Jason said finally, breaking the contemplative silence, "I've been thinking a lot about what Lieutenant Jackson said earlier, about respect being the default, not something earned through displays of medals." "A wise perspective," Maggie acknowledged. "But here's what I don't understand," Jason continued, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "That day at Walmart, when we were so awful to you, you could have told us who you were, shown us your medals, made us feel even worse than we already did once the SEALs showed up. But you didn't. You never once mentioned your service record or tried to use it to put us in our place. Why not?" It was a perceptive question, one that struck at the heart of who Maggie Sullivan was as a person. She considered her response carefully. "Because my worth as a human being isn't contingent on my service record, Jason, just as your worth isn't erased by one terrible choice." She set her coffee cup down, gathering her thoughts. "The medals recognize actions performed under extraordinary circumstances. They don't make me more deserving of basic decency than any other person you might encounter." She looked at each of the teenagers in turn, making sure they understood the point she was making. "The lesson here isn't that you should be respectful to veterans because they might have medals or heroic stories. It's that you should be respectful to everyone because each person has inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their age, appearance, or the uniform they once wore." Danny nodded approval. "Couldn't have said it better myself." That evening, after the teenagers had departed and Danny had returned to his hotel, Maggie sat in her quiet apartment, the framed photograph of Travis, in his Navy uniform positioned on her mantel alongside images of her own service years. She found herself reflecting on the strange symmetry of life, how a moment of disrespect in a Walmart aisle had set in motion a series of events that led not only to her reconnection with a patient she had saved half a century ago, but also to the potential redemption of 7 young people who might otherwise have continued down a path of callousness and disregard for others. The next morning, Danny arrived promptly at 9 a.m. as arranged, but he wasn't alone. With him was a distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in a suit that spoke of quiet wealth and taste. "Captain Sullivan," Danny said formally, "may I present Dr. James Harrison, Chief of Surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, and my son-in-law." Maggie welcomed them both, curious about this unexpected addition to their plans. As they settled in her living room, Dr. Harrison explained his presence. "Captain Sullivan, when Danny told me he was finally meeting the Navy nurse who saved his leg in Vietnam, I insisted on coming along. You see, I've heard about you my entire career. You're something of a legend in trauma surgery circles. Maggie's eyebrows rose in surprise. I'm afraid you must be mistaken, Dr. Harrison. I've been retired from nursing for decades, and I was never involved in developing surgical protocols or publishing research. Harrison smiled. Not directly, perhaps, but the techniques you implemented under combat conditions, particularly your approach to vascular repair in limb trauma, were documented by Dr. Thomas Reynolds, who worked alongside you in Vietnam. He later incorporated those innovations into the surgical training program at Walter Reed, where I did my residency. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Captain Sullivan, the methods you pioneered under the most adverse conditions imaginable have saved thousands of limbs and lives in the decades since. Every trauma surgeon trained at Walter Reed for the past 40 years has learned the Sullivan approach to compromised vascular structures in extremity wounds. Maggie was stunned into silence. In all her years of service, she had never sought recognition or advancement, focusing solely on the patients in front of her, the lives she could save in the moment. The idea that her work had rippled outward through time, influencing medical practice long after she had hung up her uniform, was both humbling and overwhelming. I had no idea, she finally managed. Few innovations in medicine can be traced to a single source, Harrison continued. But in your case, Dr. Reynolds was meticulous about crediting you. He wrote in his memoirs that watching you work under artillery fire, improvising with limited resources, but never compromising on patient outcomes, changed his entire approach to trauma medicine. Danny reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. See, I'm not the only life you saved. That extends far beyond that field hospital. That afternoon, as they continued their volunteer work at the VA hospital, Maggie found herself viewing her service through a new lens, not just as a chapter of her life that had ended decades ago, but as an ongoing contribution that continued to save lives through the medical professionals trained in techniques she had developed under the pressure of combat. It was a profound realization, one that shifted her perspective on her own legacy. She had always measured the value of her service in individual lives saved, specific patients she had helped. Now she understood that the ripple effects of her work extended far beyond those direct interventions, touching lives she would never know in ways she couldn't have imagined. As they made their rounds, they encountered Travis again, this time accompanying Walter Perkins to a physical therapy session. The gruff Vietnam veteran had become an unlikely mentor to the teenager, sharing hard-earned wisdom about military service and life in general. "Sullivan!" Walter called when he spotted them. "Looking sharp with the hardware today. Special occasion." "Just remembering who I used to be, Walter," Maggie replied with a small smile. "Who you still are," Walter corrected firmly. "The uniform changes, the body ages, but the core doesn't. Once Navy, always Navy." Travis nodded agreement. "That's what Commander Jackson says too." "Smart man, my son," Danny interjected with paternal pride. As they continued through the hospital, they passed the recreation room where a special event was underway. A video call with Lieutenant Commander Ryan Jackson from his deployed location. A group of veterans and volunteers had gathered to speak. With him, part of a morale program connecting deployed service members with their support networks back home. When they entered the room, Ryan's face on the large screen broke into a wide smile. "Dad! Captain Sullivan! I didn't expect to see you both today." "Surprise visit, son," Danny explained. "Thought we'd drop in and say hello while we were making rounds with the captain." Ryan's expression grew more serious. "Captain Sullivan, how are you? Is my team checking in regularly as promised?" "They are, Commander. Your men have been most attentive, almost excessively so," Maggie replied with a hint of her dry humor. Chief Rodriguez seems to think my porch needed rebuilding, and Petty Officer Maleko apparently couldn't sleep at night knowing my car hadn't been serviced recently. Ryan laughed. They take their assignments seriously, Mom, and looking after the Angel of Saigon is about as serious as it gets. The video call continued, with Ryan sharing limited details about his deployment and inquiring about the progress of the teenagers' community service program. He seemed particularly pleased to hear about Travis's decision to enlist in the Navy. "Good choice, Mitchell," he said when Travis stepped forward at his request. "The Navy needs people who understand the importance of respect and service. You've learned that lesson the hard way, which often makes it stick better." "Yes, sir," Travis replied, standing straighter under the SEAL commander's attention. "I won't forget." When the call ended, the group dispersed, but Maggie noticed a new energy in the volunteers and veterans alike, a sense of connection to active service members that bridged the gap between past and present, between those who had completed their missions and those still engaged in them. That evening, their last together before Danny returned to Arizona, they shared a quiet dinner at Maggie's apartment. The conversation flowed easily between them. Two lives that had briefly intersected in the chaos of war, now reconnected in the peace of their sunset years. "I've been thinking," Danny said as they finished their coffee, "about what Jason asked yesterday. Why you didn't tell those kids about your service record when they disrespected you at Walmart." "It wasn't relevant," Maggie replied simply. "But it was," Danny insisted gently. "Not because the medals should have earned you better treatment, but because understanding who you are, who you've been, might have taught them something important about judgment and assumptions." Maggie considered this perspective. "Perhaps, but I've never been comfortable using my service for personal advantage." "It's not about advantage, Maggie. It's about education." Danny leaned forward, his expression earnest. "These kids are growing up in a world where the costs and meaning of service are increasingly abstract to them. Fewer families have direct military connections. The wars of their lifetime have been fought by a small professional force, not through national mobilization like in our day." He gestured to the photograph of Travis in his Navy uniform. "That boy is joining the service because he finally understood something about duty and sacrifice, because he saw it embodied in you, in my son, in the SEALs who responded to your call. That's a powerful legacy, Maggie, more powerful than any surgical technique or medal." His words resonated with Maggie, touching on thoughts that had been forming in her mind throughout their time together. Perhaps there was value in sharing her story more openly, not for recognition or praise, but as a bridge between generations, a way of ensuring that the values she had lived by didn't fade with the passing of her generation. The next morning, as they prepared to say goodbye, Danny presented Maggie with a small, carefully wrapped package. "A token of my gratitude," he explained, "though nothing could ever fully express what I owe you." Inside was a beautifully crafted shadow box containing a replica of his dog tags from Vietnam, a photograph of him with his wife on their wedding day, standing proudly on the leg Maggie had saved, and a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "To Captain Margaret Sullivan, who gave me back my future, with eternal gratitude, Lieutenant Daniel Jackson, USMC." Maggie found herself at a loss for words, deeply moved by the simple eloquence of the gift and all it represented. "Thank you, Danny. I'll treasure this." "One more thing," Danny said, reaching into his pocket. "Ryan asked me to give you this. It's a satellite phone that connects directly to his team no matter where they're deployed. He said to tell you that the Navy takes care of its own and you're never to hesitate to call if you need anything at all." As they embraced, in farewell, Maggie felt a sense of completion, of circles closing and new ones beginning. The scared young Marine whose leg she had fought to save was now a distinguished veteran in his own right, his life a testament to the value of her efforts. His son carried forward the tradition of service, leading a new generation of warriors who understood the sacred obligation to honor those who had come before. And perhaps most remarkably, the disrespectful teenagers who had mocked her in Walmart were being transformed through their exposure to the values of service and sacrifice, finding purpose and meaning in giving of themselves to others. After Danny departed, Maggie placed the shadow box on her mantel alongside Travis's photograph and her own service mementos. Together, they told a story that spanned generations, a story of service, sacrifice, respect, and the enduring bonds that connect those who understand the true meaning of duty. The following Saturday, when the teenagers arrived for their regular volunteer shift, Maggie greeted them wearing her Navy cross pin, a small but significant change from her usual modest appearance. She watched their reactions, noting the new level of understanding in their eyes, the genuine respect that had replaced their initial reluctant compliance. "Before we begin today," she said as they gathered for their assignments, "I'd like to share something with you. Not because it makes me special or more deserving of respect than anyone else, but because understanding our shared history helps us move forward together." And for the first time in decades, Margaret Maggie Sullivan, Captain Navy Nurse Corps, retired, began to tell her story, not for her own glory, but as a gift to a new generation who needed to understand the cost and meaning of the freedoms they enjoyed. As she spoke of her service in Korea and Vietnam, of the lives saved and lost, of the bonds forged in crisis that never truly broke, she saw in their faces the dawning of real comprehension, the realization that history wasn't just dates and events in textbooks, but lived experience that shaped the world they inhabited. In that moment, Maggie understood that this was perhaps her most important mission yet, bridging the gap between generations, ensuring that the values of duty, honor, and respect for others continued to be passed forward. It wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about connection, about reminding these young people that they were part of something larger than themselves, a continuum of service and sacrifice that stretched back through history and forward into a future they would help to shape. The Navy takes care of its own, always has, always will, and in that simple truth lay a profound lesson about community, responsibility, and the enduring power of respect, a lesson that would ripple outward from a chance encounter in a Walmart aisle to touch lives in ways that none of them could yet imagine. Maggie Sullivan had spent her life in service to others. Now, in her sunset years, she was discovering that the greatest service of all might be in sharing the wisdom those years had brought her, not through lectures or demands for respect, but through the quiet example of a life well lived and the gentle guidance that helped others find their own path to meaningful service. In the end, that was the true legacy of the Angel of Saigon, not just the lives she had saved on distant battlefields, but the lives she continued to touch, to inspire, to redirect toward purpose and meaning. A legacy not of medals and commendations, but of ripples spreading outward through time, touching shores she would never see, but changing them nonetheless. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.